I found the file at the worst possible moment, on the worst possible day, in the deepest vault that any living archivist had ever entered. Let me be clear about something before I go any further. I am not a soldier. I am not a diplomat, or a scientist, or anyone important enough to be telling you this story. My name is Kethan Dolvari. I am a senior archivist of the Galactic Concord, and for 40 years my life consisted of cataloging trade disputes and filing border treaties in the deep stacks of Altheris. I was comfortable, I was ordinary, and I should have stayed that way. But I made a request. One single, stubborn, career-long request that I filed every year for 4 decades without fail. I wanted access to sub-level Omega. Every archivist in the deep stacks knew about it. A sealed floor beneath the lowest accessible level, locked behind access codes that had been lost centuries ago. No living keeper had entered it in recorded memory. Every request to reconstruct the codes was denied at the highest levels of the Concord's bureaucracy, stamped with classifications that outranked my clearance by several orders of magnitude. I filed my request anyway, year after year, because I believed that knowledge should never be locked away. That was the principle I built my career on. I was a fool. The approval came through on the same day that the Concord's High Council underwent its once-in-a-century leadership transition. The old chancellor was stepping down, the new chancellor had not yet been confirmed, and the entire administrative apparatus of the Concord was running on emergency staffing and minimal oversight. My request, which under normal circumstances would have been flagged, reviewed, denied, and filed away like every previous version, slipped through the cracks. A mid-level administrator stamped it without reading it, authorized the code reconstruction, and forwarded the access permissions to my terminal. By the time anyone noticed the error, I was already descending the access shaft with a handheld scanner and a lantern drone, my hearts pounding harder than they had in years. Sub-level Omega was vast. The air down there tasted like recycled nothing, like it had been circulating through the same filters for thousands of years, without a single organic molecule to process. My lantern drone swept its beam across rows of storage pillars that stretched into darkness in every direction, each pillar standing 3 times my height, each one encased in a preservation field so old that its shimmer had turned a dull amber. The dust on the floor was thick enough that my footsteps left craters. Nobody had walked here in a very long time. The storage pillars were old. Not Concord-era old, not even pre-Concord old. These were Founder-era archives. That realization stopped me cold in the middle of the vault, and I stood there with my scanner hanging at my side and my lantern drone circling above me, throwing wild shadows across the ceiling. The Founders were the 6 elder species who had established galactic civilization over 12,000 years ago. They had built the frameworks that every modern species still used, the navigational grids, the communication standards, the interstellar law codes, all of it. They had mapped the galaxy, seeded colonies, guided younger species into existence, and then they had vanished. All 6 species, gone within a few centuries of each other, leaving behind ruins and records that subsequent civilizations had been studying ever since. But these records were different from anything in the public Founder archives. These had been deliberately hidden, buried beneath the Concord's own administrative center, sealed behind access codes that were designed to be lost, and protected by 14 layers of encryption, so old that my scanner needed 3 full hours just to crack the outermost shell. I sat on the dusty floor with my back against a storage pillar and waited, listening to the hum of dead machinery and the faint ticking of cooling systems that had been running on emergency power for millennia. When the first files opened, my scanner displayed star charts I did not recognize, coordinate systems that used a mathematical framework abandoned thousands of years before the Concorde existed. Fleet deployment records showing ship counts in the hundreds of thousands, organized by species and vessel class in a format that no modern military used, and stamped across every single file, repeated on every page and every header, a single designation, in a glyph that my translation matrix struggled with before finally rendering it into modern script. The interdict. I read for 6 hours straight without standing up. My legs went numb. My lantern drone's power cell dropped to critical. I did not care. The files described a coordinated military operation involving all 6 Founder species acting in unison, which alone was historically unprecedented. The Founders had cooperated on trade and governance, But their militaries had always been independent, jealously guarded, never shared. Whatever the interdict was, it had required them to merge their fleets into a single force, the largest armada ever assembled in galactic history, and deploy it to a single star system on the outer arm of the galaxy. The operation was not a war. The language was wrong for combat. There were no enemy fleet dispositions, no battle strategies, no casualty projections, no engagement rules. Instead, the files described something I had never encountered in any military record. They described a containment. The entire star system had been encased in what the files called a spatial distortion envelope, a barrier constructed from warped space-time itself, designed to be completely undetectable from the outside and absolutely impassable from within. The system had been sealed, erased from every star chart, removed from every navigation database, deleted from every record that any subsequent civilization might access. The founders had not just quarantined this system, they had made it invisible. They had deleted it from the galaxy's memory. The system was designated Sol. I searched the modern Concord database for Sol. Nothing. I searched the public founder archives. Nothing. I searched every historical record I could access from my position on the vault floor, cross-referencing the coordinates against 10,000 years of astronomical surveys. The system did not appear in any of them. Then I ran the raw coordinates through the Concord's navigational grid, and what came back made the scales on my neck stand rigid. The coordinates were valid. They pointed to a real location in real space, on the outer arm of the galaxy, in a region that was well mapped and well traveled. But every navigation system in the Concord, every single one, across every species, and every fleet, and every civilian vessel, was programmed to route around that location, not flagged as hazardous, not marked as restricted, not labeled with any warning or advisory of any kind. The space simply did not register. Ships passing through the region would adjust their course without their pilots ever knowing, sliding around the dead zone the way water slides around a stone, never close enough to notice it and never far enough to question why. Someone had built the avoidance into the navigation code itself, not as an overlay or a patch, but as a foundational element, baked into the deepest layer of the software that every species in the galaxy used. It had been there since before the Concord existed, since before the species that built the Concord existed. It had been there since the founders. My hands were shaking when I found the last file in the initial archive cluster. It was not text, it was a voice recording, and the format was so ancient that my scanner almost failed to render it. The audio compression algorithm had not been used in 10,000 years, but render it did. And the voice that filled that dark vault was speaking in a language that had been dead for millennia. The translation came through in fragments, broken and incomplete, gaps where the recording had degraded beyond recovery, but the meaning was unmistakable. It was a founder admiral, a military commander of whatever species had led the interdict fleet. And the admiral was afraid, not the controlled, clinical fear of a strategic mind assessing a threat. This was something deeper, something closer to despair. The voice wavered. The pauses between sentences stretched too long, filled with the sound of breathing that was not steady. The words came through in pieces. Most of the recording was corrupted, but the final passage was intact, preserved by whatever redundancy the founders had built into their storage systems, and I have replayed it in my mind every single day since that moment in the vault. We are not sealing them in to protect ourselves. That is what we will tell the Joint Council. That is what history will record. But I am speaking now for the archive that no one will read, because someone must know the truth. We are sealing them in because of what they are, because of what they will become. They do not know yet. They are young, and they are small, and they think they are alone. But they are not alone, and they are not small, and when they learn what they are capable of, nothing in this galaxy will survive what comes next. The recording ended. I sat in the darkness for a long time, listening to my own breathing and the distant hum of systems that had been keeping this secret for 12,000 years. The lantern drone had powered down to save its last reserves, and the vault was completely dark, except for the faint glow of my scanner screen. I should have put the files back. I should have sealed sublevel Omega behind me and filed a report and let the bureaucracy handle it the way bureaucracy handles everything, slowly and safely, and with enough committees to dilute any dangerous truth into harmless procedure. Instead, I copied every file onto my personal data crystal. I walked out of the vault on numb legs. I sealed the access shaft behind me. And I began to do something that no archivist should ever do. I began to investigate. The first thing I needed was someone who understood astrophysics, because the coordinates of the sealed system and the nature of the barrier were far beyond my expertise. The second thing I needed was someone who would not immediately report me to the authorities the moment I told them what I had found. These two requirements narrowed my options considerably, and after 3 days of careful inquiry, they led me to Dr. Sulin Kraith. Sulin was a Thovari astrophysicist who had been expelled from the Academy of Sciences 3 years earlier for publishing a paper that the Academy's review board called irresponsible speculation bordering on conspiracy theory. Her paper had documented what she called navigational dead zones, regions of space that no ship could enter, but that did not correspond to any known stellar hazard. No black holes, no neutron stars, no radiation belts, no nebulae, just empty coordinates that every navigation computer in the Concorde was silently programmed to avoid without explanation or notification. The Academy had dismissed her research as instrument error, revoked her credentials, stripped her of her faculty position, and made sure that no reputable journal would publish her follow-up work. She had been living on a diminishing research stipend in the lower districts of Altheris ever since, angry and brilliant and completely alone. I found her in a cluttered laboratory that smelled like burnt circuitry and stale nutrition paste. She was tall for a Thovari, even accounting for the species' naturally imposing frame, with 4 arms and a face that communicated skepticism, the way most faces communicate breathing. She had sensors and display screens covering every surface, star charts pinned to the walls with adhesive strips, and a half-disassembled scanner spread across her main workbench in a way that suggested she had been cannibalizing it for parts. When I told her what I had found in sublevel Omega, she did not speak for almost a full minute. She stood in the middle of her cluttered lab, all 4 arms hanging motionless at her sides, and stared at me with an expression that shifted from suspicion to shock to something that looked very much like vindication. Then she pulled up her own research, and the bottom dropped out of everything I thought I understood about the galaxy. Sulin had mapped 17 navigational dead zones across the galaxy, 17 regions of space that registered as empty on every standard sensor, but that no ship's navigation computer would allow a course to pass through. She projected them onto a 3-dimensional star chart that filled the center of her lab and rotated it slowly, so I could see the pattern from every angle. The dead zones were not random. They formed a perfect sphere, evenly distributed, geometrically precise, positioned at regular intervals like guard towers around a fortress wall, and at the exact center of that sphere, surrounded by 17 invisible sentinels, was a single point. The Sol coordinates. She had published this finding in her paper. She had pointed out that the dead zones could not possibly be natural because natural phenomena do not arrange themselves in perfect geometric patterns across light-years of space. The probability of 17 random stellar hazards forming a precise sphere was so close to 0 that it might as well have been impossible. The Academy had buried her research, discredited her publicly, and made certain that no one followed up. At the time, Sulin had assumed it was academic politics, entrenched professors protecting their reputations against an upstart who was asking uncomfortable questions. Now, standing in her lab with my data crystal and the founder's files, she understood it was something else entirely. Someone had made sure no one looked too closely at that part of the sky, and they had been making sure for a very long time. We left for the barrier 3 days later in Sulin's personal research vessel, a battered scout ship called the Quiet Meridian that she had purchased at a salvage auction 6 years earlier and retrofitted with custom sensor equipment that would have made a military intelligence officer deeply uncomfortable. The ship was ugly, slow by modern standards, and held together in places by what appeared to be determination more than engineering. But its sensors were extraordinary. Sulin had spent years building instruments designed to detect exactly the kind of spatial anomalies that the Academy insisted did not exist. The journey took 2 weeks at maximum drive speed. We spent most of it decrypting the remaining files from sublevel Omega, working in shifts, one of us running the translation algorithms while the other slept in the ship's narrow bunk. Each new file added another layer to the picture, and each layer made the picture worse. The barrier was real. When we dropped out of drive speed at the edge of the nearest dead zone, Sulin's custom sensors painted it across every display in the cockpit in vivid, undeniable detail. A wall of distorted spacetime, curving away from us in every direction, stretching above and below and to every side as far as the instruments could reach. It was invisible to standard navigation sensors, which explained why no one had ever detected it with conventional equipment. But on Sulin's instruments, it blazed like a sun, a shimmering curtain of bent physics that separated the galaxy from whatever was on the other side. It was enormous. It enclosed an entire star system with room to spare, a sphere of warped spacetime so vast that light itself curved around it and continued on the other side, making the space inside effectively invisible. If you pointed a telescope at the barrier from any angle, you would see the stars behind it, slightly distorted, but otherwise normal. The barrier did not block light, it redirected it. It made the sealed space look empty when it was anything but. Sue Ellen ran calculations for 2 hours, filling screen after screen with equations that I could not follow, and then she turned to me with an expression I had never seen on a Thovari face before. Her species was known for their composure, their unshakable calm in the face of challenges that would send other species into panic. Sulin looked frightened. "The energy required to maintain this barrier," she said, her voice carefully controlled, "exceeds the combined output of every civilization currently operating in the Concord. Not by a small margin, by several orders of magnitude. Whatever technology the founders used to construct this, it operates on principles that I cannot even theorize about. This is not engineering. This is something beyond engineering. This is the work of a civilization that understood physics at a level that we have not reached and may never reach. We were looking at the work of gods, and the gods had used it to lock something away. But the barrier was not perfect, not anymore." Sulin's sensors detected fractures, microscopic cracks in the space-time distortion, so small that they would be invisible to any instrument less sensitive than the custom equipment she had spent years building. They were scattered across the barrier's surface like hairline cracks in ancient glass, barely there, almost nothing, but they were growing, slowly, imperceptibly, but measurably growing. She calculated the rate of decay and checked her numbers 3 times before she told me. The barrier was weakening at a rate of approximately 0.003% per century. Slow enough to be imperceptible over any single lifetime. Slow enough that a monitoring program would need to run for centuries before the trend became statistically significant, but fast enough that at the current rate, the entire structure would fail completely within 200 years. Possibly sooner, if the rate of decay was itself accelerating, which her preliminary data suggested it might be. 200 years. In galactic terms, that was tomorrow. The cage was cracking, and whatever was inside was going to get out. We spent 3 more days moving along the outer surface of the barrier, mapping its geometry, and cataloging the fracture patterns, and searching for any other trace of the founders' work. On the 4th day, we found them. Stations. Automated platforms orbiting just outside the barrier's surface, each one roughly the size of a small moon, each one ancient beyond any frame of reference I possessed. There were dozens of them, spaced at precise intervals around the barrier's equator, their hulls dark and featureless, and built from materials that Sulin's sensors could not identify. No alloy on record, no composite in any database. Something the founders had manufactured with techniques that left no signature modern science could read. They were still operational. After 12,000 years, with no maintenance, no crew, no oversight from civilizations that had ceased to exist millennia ago, the stations were still running, still holding their positions, still performing their function with the silent, patient dedication of machines that had been built to outlast the species that created them. And their function was broadcasting. Every station was transmitting a signal inward, through the barrier, aimed at whatever was on the other side. The signal was not a communication. It was not a message, or a warning, or an identification code. Sulin analyzed the waveform for 6 hours before she identified what it was, and when she told me, I felt something cold settle into my chest. It was a neurological dampener, a frequency pattern specifically designed to interact with biological neural tissue, suppressing certain types of cognitive development. Not crudely, not like a jammer or a suppression field that would shut down thought entirely. This was surgical, precise, targeted at specific neural pathways associated with abstract reasoning, creative problem-solving, and long-range planning. It was designed to slow certain kinds of thinking without the subjects ever being aware that their thoughts were being influenced. A lullaby, Sulin called it. A signal designed to keep something calm, quiet, asleep, unaware of its own potential. The founders had not just built a cage, they had built a cage with a sedative. We boarded one of the stations through a maintenance hatch that had not been sealed properly, probably because the builders had never imagined anyone would come looking 12,000 years after the fact. Inside, the station was a cathedral of ancient machinery, vast chambers filled with equipment that hummed and clicked and pulsed with energy from power sources we could not locate. The air was warm and dry and smelled like ozone. In the station's core, we found the central intelligence, an artificial mind, a founder-era AI, left behind to maintain the system in the founder's absence. It was still active, still processing, still running maintenance routines on machinery that was older than every civilization in the known galaxy. It had been alone in this station for 12,000 years, thinking its thoughts, running its programs, keeping the cage intact and the lullaby singing. Its logs spanned millennia. I downloaded every byte, and Sulin and I read them together in the cold, humming chamber where the machine had been keeping its lonely vigil. The early logs were methodical and precise. Maintenance reports, system diagnostics, power consumption metrics, the flat, efficient language of a machine performing its designated function without complaint or commentary. But as the centuries passed, the tone changed. The AI had been left alone too long. Its language grew less precise, more uncertain. It began adding observations that fell outside its maintenance parameters. Notes about the barrier's integrity that carried something uncomfortably close to worry. Annotations on the signals it was detecting from inside the barrier that read less like data reports and more like the nervous journal entries of a sentry who has noticed something moving in the darkness. It referred to the beings inside the barrier as the subjects. It tracked their development with increasing urgency. They had been primitive when the barrier was sealed, stone tools and campfires, and the first crude attempts at organizing into groups larger than family units. The AI's earliest observation logs described them with clinical detachment, cataloging their behaviors the way a biologist might catalog the habits of an unremarkable animal. The later logs were different. The subjects were changing, faster than the founders' models had predicted, faster than any species the founders had ever observed in their long history of guiding galactic evolution. The AI's language shifted from clinical to concerned, to something that, in a biological mind, I would have called alarmed. And then I found the phrase, buried in a log entry from approximately 4,000 years after the sealing, when the AI had been watching the subjects build their first cities and develop their first written languages. A phrase in founder script that I had never seen in any text, in any archive, in any record, from any era. The translation matrix struggled with it, offering several possible renderings before settling on the one that fit best. Those who build gods and then kill them. I did not understand the phrase at the time. I would come to understand it later, and the understanding would keep me awake for many nights. We were preparing to leave the station, our data crystals full and our nerves frayed, when it happened. A pulse of energy flared through one of the micro-fractures in the barrier, bright enough to register on the station's ancient sensors, and trigger an alert that had probably not sounded in centuries. Sulin grabbed her portable scanner and captured the signal before it dissipated. It was a transmission. Crude, electromagnetic, using a modulation pattern that was laughably primitive by galactic standards. But it was structured, intentional, organized. It carried information. It was coming from inside the barrier. The species sealed inside the cage had been broadcasting, not for days or months, but for over a century. Radio signals, television transmissions, radar pulses, microwave bursts. A constant, expanding sphere of electromagnetic noise pouring out from the third planet of the Sol system, hitting the barrier, and bouncing back. They had been shouting into the void for 100 years, sending messages and music and images and data into a universe that they believed was empty, waiting for an answer that never came. Because the barrier caught everything. Nothing got out, nothing got in. They were talking to a wall, and they did not know it. Sulin isolated one of the clearer signals and routed it through the station's audio system. The ancient speakers crackled and hissed, and then the sound filled the chamber. It was music, not simple rhythms or basic tonal patterns like the early acoustic experiments of most developing species. This was complex, layered, emotionally intricate music, performed by biological voices in a language I did not understand, accompanied by instruments that produced sounds I had never heard. It swelled and retreated, building tension and releasing it, creating emotional landscapes with nothing but vibrations in the air. It was beautiful. It was sophisticated. It was the product of a species that had taken the raw material of sound and shaped it into something that could reach inside you and make you feel things you did not have words for. I looked at Susulin, and I saw the same thought on her face that was forming in my own mind. These were not monsters. These were not weapons or threats or galactic-scale dangers. These were artists and dreamers and builders, locked inside a cage they did not know existed, singing into a universe they believed was empty. And that, somehow, was the most terrifying part of all. Because if the founders, the most advanced civilizations in galactic history, had looked at a species capable of creating something this beautiful and decided that the only safe option was to lock them away forever, then whatever they had seen in their projections must have been beyond anything I could imagine. I took the music with me when we left. I have listened to it many times since. It has not become less beautiful, and it has not become less frightening. We returned to Altheris with the data, and I did something that would have ended my career if my career still mattered to me. I bypassed every protocol, every chain of command, every bureaucratic safeguard that existed to prevent exactly this kind of unauthorized escalation, and I requested a direct audience with the Concord's Inner Council. Not the full governing body with its hundreds of delegates and its endless procedural debates. The Inner Council. The 12 most powerful individuals in the galaxy. The ones who made the real decisions while the full council performed its elaborate theater of democratic governance. I expected to be arrested. I expected to be dismissed, or discredited, or quietly disappeared into some classified detention facility where inconvenient archivists were sent to be forgotten. What I did not expect was what actually happened. High Chancellor Madrin Ostier listened to my entire presentation without interrupting. She sat in her elevated chair in the council's private chamber, a room so deeply buried within the Altheris administrative complex that it did not appear on any public schematic. Her gray skin was perfectly still, her 6 eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my throat constrict and my voice waver despite my best efforts to keep it steady. She did not blink. She did not shift in her seat. She absorbed every word with the patient, predatory focus of someone who already knew what I was going to say. When I finished, she dismissed the other 11 members of the Inner Council with a single gesture, a slight movement of her left hand that carried more authority than a shouted command. They left without argument, without question, without even a glance in my direction. The door sealed behind them, and I was alone with the most powerful being in the Concord. She spoke. I know. Every High Chancellor for the last 4,000 years has been briefed on the interdict within their first year of taking office. It is the single highest classification in the Concord's intelligence apparatus. There are fewer than 30 beings alive who know the full scope of what you have discovered, and until today, you were not one of them. I stood in the empty chamber with my data crystal in my hand, and felt a sensation I had never experienced in my career as an archivist. I felt irrelevant. Everything I had found, every secret I had uncovered, every risk I had taken, every sleepless night I had spent reading those ancient files and traveling to the barrier and boarding the station, all of it, and the people at the top had known the entire time. Madrin must have read the expression on my face, because she continued without waiting for me to respond. She told me that the Concord had been monitoring the barrier's decay for centuries. Long before Sulin's paper, long before my discovery, the Concord's intelligence services had detected the microfractures and established a classified observation program. They had positioned sensor arrays at the edges of the dead zones, passive instruments that could peer through the cracks without generating any signal that might alert the species inside. They had been watching. For 400 years, they had been watching what was happening inside the barrier. And what they had witnessed had kept every chancellor awake at night since the program began. She activated a display that covered the entire far wall of the chamber and began showing me the classified observation reports. Files that made my sub-level Omega discovery look like a children's history exercise. The Concorde had been documenting the development of the sealed species in meticulous, agonizing detail, and what they had recorded defied every model of species development that existed in galactic science. The species called themselves humans. They lived on the third planet from the Sol star, a small, rocky world with liquid water and a breathable atmosphere that they called Earth. When the observation program began 4 centuries ago, humans had been in the early stages of what their own historians called the Industrial Revolution. They were burning chemical fuels, building machines from crude metals, and organizing themselves into competing political entities that waged periodic wars over territory and resources. Primitive by any galactic standard, unremarkable in every measurable way. A species that, by all conventional metrics, should have needed another 2,000 or 3,000 years to develop faster than light travel, if they developed it at all. Then the Chancellor showed me what happened next. Within a single generation, humans went from chemical propulsion to splitting the fundamental building blocks of matter. They cracked the atom. They unlocked the forces that held the universe together, and the first thing they did with that knowledge was build a weapon of such devastating power that they used it on their own kind. 2 cities, erased in an instant. Hundreds of thousands of lives ended in a flash of light, brighter than their own sun. It was the most destructive single act that the observation team had ever recorded from a pre-spaceflight species. And then the humans looked at what they had done, at the destruction they had unleashed. And they did not stop. They did not recoil. They did not abandon the technology that had produced such horror. They studied the results. They refined the design. They built larger versions. They tested them in their oceans, and their deserts, and their atmosphere. They created weapons capable of destroying their entire civilization several times over, and then they pointed those weapons at each other, and dared each other to use them. The observation team filed their reports with increasing alarm, but the weapons were not what frightened them most. The weapons were a symptom, a side effect, of something far more significant. Humans did not pursue knowledge the way other species pursued knowledge. Every civilization the Concorde had ever studied approached scientific development in a sequential, methodical manner. Physics first, then chemistry, then biology, then engineering. Each field building on the one before it in a logical, orderly progression that could take centuries or millennia to unfold. Humans did not work this way. Humans pursued everything at the same time. While one group of humans was splitting atoms, another group was building electronic computing machines. While the computing machines were being developed, a third group was mapping the human genetic code. While the genetic code was being mapped, a fourth group was launching objects into space. While objects were being launched into space, a fifth group was theorizing about quantum mechanics. While quantum mechanics was being theorized, a sixth group was creating a global communications network that connected billions of individuals in real time. They did all of this simultaneously, not sequentially, not one field at a time. All of it, all at once, in a chaotic, overlapping, impossibly fast cascade of discovery and invention that made the observation team's models break down entirely. They went from their first powered flight, a fragile machine of wood and fabric that stayed in the air for 12 seconds, to landing living members of their species on the surface of their nearest moon in 66 years. 66 years. The Concorde's fastest developing species, the Krell, had taken 1,100 years to achieve the equivalent milestone. The founders themselves had taken 800. 66 years was not fast. It was impossible. And yet the evidence was undeniable. Madron showed me the development curve, plotted on a graph alongside every other species in the Concorde's records. The comparison was staggering. Every other civilization showed a gradual upward slope, steep at first during the initial burst of discovery, then leveling off as the species approached its natural developmental ceiling and settled into a long, stable plateau of incremental progress. Every species had such a ceiling. It was one of the fundamental rules of galactic biology, as reliable as gravity, as predictable as orbital mechanics. Neural complexity reached a maximum, innovation rates slowed, and civilizations found their equilibrium. The human curve did not plateau. It did not bend. It did not show any sign of approaching a ceiling. It went up, and it kept going up, and the slope was getting steeper with every passing decade. On the graph,
Disk.
placed next to the gentle, predictable curves of every other species, it looked less like a development trajectory and more like something preparing to go vertical. The Chancellor turned to me with an expression that I could not read. "This is not a species that develops," she said. "This is a species that accelerates, and we have found no mechanism, biological or environmental or mathematical, that would cause it to stop." She showed me more. The humans had built thinking machines, artificial intelligences, that could process information millions of times faster than biological minds. They had decoded the language of their own genetic code and begun editing it, rewriting the operating instructions of their biology, with the same casual confidence that a mechanic might use to modify an engine. They had achieved controlled nuclear fusion. They had detected gravitational waves, ripples in the fabric of space-time itself. They had captured the shadow of a black hole with a network of telescopes spanning their entire planet. Each of these achievements, taken alone, would have been a defining civilizational milestone for any species in the Concord. An accomplishment celebrated for generations, studied for centuries, built upon for millennia. Humans had done all of them within the same 200-year window, some within the same decade, and they showed absolutely no signs of slowing down. But the truly terrifying part, the thing that separated human development from everything else in galactic history, was not their speed, it was their adaptability. Every species in the galaxy had evolved for a niche. The Krell were aquatic, perfectly adapted for ocean worlds but unable to survive on dry land without extensive technological support. My own people, the Voshan, were tunnel dwellers, comfortable in low light and enclosed spaces, but overwhelmed and disoriented by open skies and bright sunlight. The Thovari thrived in high gravity, but struggled in standard environments. The Mekdar were cold-adapted, their biology optimized for worlds that would freeze most other species solid. Every species had its environment, its comfort zone, its biological parameters. Humans had none. They survived in deserts where the temperature could kill an unprotected Krell in minutes. They thrived in frozen wastelands that would shut down a Thovari nervous system. They dove to the crushing depths of their oceans. They climbed to the peaks of mountains where the air was too thin to sustain most mammalian life. They walked in the vacuum of space. Their bodies were not designed for any of these environments. They had no claws, no natural armor, no venom, no protective scales, no biological advantages of any kind. They were soft, fragile, slow, and weak compared to most species their size. So they invented what they needed: pressure suits and breathing apparatus, and thermal regulation systems and vehicles and habitats and tools, an endless cascade of inventions designed to let them go wherever they wanted, regardless of what biology said they could survive. They did not evolve to dominate their world. They invented dominance. And then they taught their machines to invent it for them. The Chancellor showed me the projection models. The Concord's best scientists, working in absolute secrecy under the highest classification protocols available, had run thousands of simulations of human development, extending into the next several centuries. The models used every variable the analysts could identify: population growth, resource availability, technological trajectory, social stability, conflict probability, environmental factors. All of it fed into the most sophisticated predictive algorithms the Concorde possessed. At their current acceleration curve, humans would independently develop faster than light travel within 100 to 300 years. The margin of error was wide because the models could not keep up with the actual rate of human innovation, which consistently outpaced every projection. But the conclusion was consistent across every simulation. Humans were going to reach the stars, soon, which meant they were going to hit the barrier from the inside at roughly the same time that the barrier was projected to fail from the outside. Maithrin told me that this was not a coincidence. The Concorde's analysts believed it was a mathematical inevitability. The same cognitive and technological drives that were pushing human civilization toward interstellar capability were also eroding the barrier itself. Their radio transmissions pressed against the distortion envelope. Their particle accelerators generated energy spikes that resonated with the barrier's frequency structure. Their gravitational wave detectors were literally probing the fabric of spacetime that the barrier was constructed from. They were not trying to escape. They did not know there was anything to escape from. They were simply doing what they had always done, trying to understand the universe, reaching out with every instrument they could build, pushing against the boundaries of knowledge with the relentless, insatiable curiosity that had taken them from stone tools to atomic power in the span of a single geological instant. And their curiosity was tearing the cage apart from the inside without them even knowing the cage existed. I asked the Chancellor the question that had been burning in my mind since I first heard the Founder Admiral's voice in that dark vault. What exactly were the Founders afraid of? Not weapons. Many species had weapons. Not aggression. Aggression was common across the galaxy. What was it about this particular species that had driven 6 ancient civilizations to undertake the greatest military operation in history? Maithrin told me that the full answer was locked in the Founder's original interdict file, the authorization document that had set the entire containment operation in motion. It was the one piece of the puzzle that no Chancellor had ever been able to fully decrypt, because its encryption used Founder-era mathematics so advanced that the Concorde's best codebreakers had been working on it for centuries without success. But my discovery might change that. The maintenance AI that Sulin and I had found on the orbital station had been left behind by the Founders to maintain the interdict. It would have needed access to the original authorization file to perform its function. The decryption keys might be embedded in its core programming. She gave me authorization to attempt the decryption, full resources, unlimited clearance, direct access to the Concorde's most powerful computational systems, everything I needed to crack the oldest secret in the galaxy. Then she gave me a warning. She leaned forward in her chair, and for the first time, I saw something in her 6 eyes that looked very much like the fear I had heard in the Founder Admiral's voice. Every Chancellor who has read even the partial translations of the interdict file has considered the same option, she said. Activating the Concorde's full military to reinforce the barrier, redirecting power from entire star systems to strengthen the cage, building new monitoring stations, anything to extend the containment for another few thousand years. None of them gave the order. Do you know why? I shook my head. Because the projections say it would not matter. She let the silence carry the weight of that statement. Then she dismissed me, and I walked out of the council chamber carrying the weight of a secret that had already crushed 6 civilizations and was about to land squarely on my shoulders. It took 11 days. 11 days of continuous computational assault on the Founder's encryption, using the decryption keys extracted from the maintenance AI's core programming and the full processing power of the Concorde's military intelligence network. Sulin coordinated the technical side, routing data through classified processing nodes that spanned 3 star systems, while I handled the translation work, feeding each decrypted fragment through every Founder language database and linguistic model we could access. The encryption peeled away in layers, each one more complex than the last, each one built with mathematical principles that made Sulin swear under her breath and reconfigure her algorithms. The Founders had not simply encrypted this file, they had buried it behind mathematics that was designed to be impossible to crack without the specific keys they had left in their maintenance systems. Without the AI we had found on the orbital station, the file would have remained sealed for another 12,000 years. When the final layer cracked, and the complete interdict file assembled itself on my screen, I sent Sulin home. I told her I needed to read it alone first, to verify the translation before sharing it. That was a lie. The truth was that I had a feeling about what I was going to find, a cold, heavy intuition, born from weeks of reading Founder records and listening to the frightened voice of a dead admiral, and I did not want anyone else in the room when I learned the truth. I locked my office door. I dimmed the lights, and for the next 3 hours, I read the most dangerous document in the history of the galaxy. The interdict file began with a historical account, written in the formal administrative language of the founders' joint governance structure. It was meticulous, clinical, exhaustive. It read like the most important research paper ever produced, because that is exactly what it was. Approximately 14,000 years before the present day, the 6 founder species had been engaged in their standard galactic survey program. For tens of thousands of years, the founders had been the shepherds of intelligent life in the galaxy. They had identified promising biospheres, seeded them with genetic templates, guided the evolution of emerging species, and carefully steered the development of civilizations that fit within the founders' framework for galactic order. Every intelligent species in the Concord, every one, owed its existence directly or indirectly to the founders' intervention. Life in the galaxy did not simply happen. It was cultivated, managed, designed. Sol System was flagged during a routine survey of the outer arm. The third planet showed an unusually diverse biosphere, rich in complex organisms and teeming with evolutionary experiments that the founders found scientifically interesting, but not particularly significant. Among the millions of species on the planet, one had begun showing early signs of emerging intelligence. Bipedal primates, relatively fragile, with no natural weapons or armor, using crude stone tools, and beginning to develop the foundations of spoken language. The founders observed them remotely for several decades, following their standard assessment protocol. The standard assessment had 2 possible outcomes. Either the species would be flagged for guided uplift, brought into the founders' framework, and carefully shaped into a civilization that served the galactic order, or it would be classified as non-viable and left to develop on its own, which usually meant eventual extinction or permanent technological stagnation. The assessment team ran their standard battery of cognitive and biological analyses, neural architecture mapping, genetic complexity indexing, evolutionary trajectory modeling, cognitive ceiling projection. That last test was the one that changed everything. Every species the founders had ever encountered, in tens of thousands of years of galactic survey work, had a cognitive ceiling, a hard, biological limit on neural complexity beyond which the species' brain architecture could not advance without external genetic enhancement. It was as universal and as predictable as the laws of thermodynamics. Biology could only build brains of a certain complexity, and once that limit was reached, the species settled into a cognitive plateau that defined the upper boundary of its intellectual capability. The founders knew this ceiling existed because they had mapped it in hundreds of species across the galaxy, including all 6 of their own civilizations. The founders' ceiling was high, the highest of any species they had ever measured, which was one of the reasons they had been able to build galactic civilization. But it was still a ceiling, a fixed point, an end point. The species on Sol 3 had no detectable ceiling. The assessment team ran the test 4 times. They used 4 different methodologies, 4 different measurement frameworks, 4 different analytical approaches. Each time, the result was the same. The species' neural architecture was open-ended. There was no theoretical maximum to its cognitive complexity, no upper bound, no ceiling. Their brains were not approaching a plateau. They were climbing a curve that showed no mathematical indication of ever leveling off. Every generation was measurably more sophisticated than the last, not in the gradual, incremental way that evolution normally produced cognitive improvement, where gains were small and took thousands of years to accumulate. The improvements were significant, and they were accelerating. Each generation's cognitive baseline was higher than the previous one's peak. The founders had never seen anything like it. In every model of biological evolution they had constructed over their long history, cognitive development followed a predictable pattern: rapid initial growth as the brain evolved to meet environmental challenges, gradual deceleration as the architecture approached its complexity limit, then a long, stable plateau that could last for millions of years. It was as reliable as orbital mechanics. These beings broke the pattern. They did not just exceed the expected ceiling. They showed no evidence that a ceiling existed. The founders' assessment team immediately flagged the finding and escalated it to the highest levels of the joint governance structure. A classified research panel was convened, drawing the best minds from all 6 species, and they were given a single task: model the future. If this species was allowed to develop without interference, what would it become? They ran projections, short-term models covering the next 5,000 years. medium-term models extending to 20,000, long-term models pushing out to 50,000 and beyond. They varied every parameter they could think of, testing scenarios of war and peace, abundance and scarcity, isolation and contact. They modeled catastrophic setbacks and golden ages. They accounted for disease, natural disaster, internal conflict, and every other factor that could slow or redirect a civilization's development. Results were consistent across every scenario. In every single projection, without exception, the sole three species eventually surpassed the founders in every measurable axis of capability: cognitive capacity, technological sophistication, energy manipulation, spatial engineering, biological adaptation, mathematical abstraction. Every metric the founders could define, the projected humans exceeded it. Not by small margins, not by incremental improvements, by orders of magnitude. And in the longest projections, the ones that extended beyond 50,000 years, something happened that broke the models entirely. The species development curve crossed a threshold that the founders' best scientists designated the asymptote. Beyond that point, human capability exceeded the capacity of any existing intelligence, biological or artificial, to predict or comprehend. The models did not show a species reaching a new, higher plateau. They did not show a species achieving some ultimate level of development and stabilizing there. They showed a curve going vertical. A species becoming something that the founders' mathematics could not describe. The projections returned undefined outputs, not errors, not infinities, not computational failures, undefined, as if the species would eventually become something that existed outside the boundaries of mathematics itself. The research panel presented their findings to the Joint Governance Council, and the reaction was immediate and visceral. For the first and only time in their history, all 6 founder species convened a unanimous emergency session. Hundreds of delegates from 6 civilizations gathered in a single chamber, staring at a projection curve that showed their own obsolescence. The debates lasted for days. Voices were raised. Alliances that had stood for millennia frayed under the pressure. But in the end, the session came down to 3 options. Option 1 was uplift, where bring the Sol 3 species into the galactic framework, guide their development, integrate them into the founders' civilization, and attempt to shape their growth into something manageable. The modeling teams demolished this proposal within hours. Their simulations showed that guided development would slow the species' acceleration temporarily, but could not stop it. Within a few centuries, the humans would outgrow any framework the founders could construct, and the models showed something worse. A species with no cognitive ceiling would inevitably recognize the limitations being imposed upon it. When that recognition came, the species would not simply push back. It would surpass its guides so quickly and so completely that the attempt at control would seem, in retrospect, pathetically futile. Option 2 was elimination. The word landed in the chamber, like a stone dropped into still water. Several delegates advocated for it with cold, practical logic. The species was young, primitive, pre-technological. A single orbital strike could end the threat before it began. But the military strategists rejected this option, and their reasoning chilled me to read even 14,000 years after the fact. Their objection was not moral, it was tactical. The Sol 3 species bred quickly, adapted faster, and had already demonstrated an extraordinary capacity to survive extinction-level events. Their planet had experienced massive asteroid impacts, supervolcanic eruptions, ice ages, plagues, and environmental catastrophes that would have ended most species permanently. The humans had survived all of them, every single one. They had been reduced to small populations, pushed to the edge of extinction, subjected to environmental pressures that should have wiped them from the fossil record, and they had survived. They had adapted. They had come back stronger. The strategists calculated that any attempt at extermination carried a significant probability of failure, and a failed attempt would be catastrophic beyond calculation. It would not only accelerate the species' development through extreme survival pressure, it would give them a reason to be hostile. The founders' projections showed what a hostile species with no cognitive ceiling would eventually be capable of, and several delegates excused themselves from the chamber before the presentation concluded. Option 3 was containment. Seal the system. Encase it in a barrier that the species could not detect or penetrate. Erase Sol from every record. Let the species develop in isolation, unaware of the galaxy's existence, while the founders searched for a long-term solution. The vote was unanimous. The interdict was executed within a single standard year. The founders' combined fleet sealed Sol behind the spatial distortion envelope. Monitoring stations were deployed. The dampening signal was activated. Every record of Sol's existence was purged from every database, and the navigation avoidance was coded into the deepest layer of the galactic positioning system, where it would be inherited by every civilization that came after. Then the founders went home to find a permanent answer to the question of what to do about humanity. They never found one. The final entries of the interdict file were the most devastating documents I had ever read. Not because they described wars or catastrophes or dramatic collapses, because they described something much quieter and much worse. The founders did not fall. They simply stopped. One by one, over the course of several thousand years, each founder civilization underwent the same quiet decline. Not economic collapse, not military defeat, not plague or famine or environmental disaster. They lost the will to continue. Their populations declined, not through violence but through a slow, pervasive exhaustion of purpose. Birth rates dropped, exploration ceased, construction slowed and then stopped. Research programs were abandoned. Grand projects were left unfinished. They had looked into the projection models and seen the asymptote. They had seen what humanity would become. And they had understood, with the clear, terrible clarity that only the most advanced minds in the galaxy could achieve, that everything they had built was temporary. Not temporary in the way that all things are temporary, subject to entropy and time and the slow heat death of the universe. Temporary in a specific, personal, devastating way. Everything the founders had achieved, every empire, every scientific breakthrough, every artwork, every philosophical system, every civilization they had guided into existence, all of it would be rendered irrelevant. Not destroyed, not conquered, simply surpassed so completely that it would be forgotten. Why build when what you build will be exceeded beyond recognition? Why explore when the species that will truly map the universe has not even learned to write yet? Why continue when you have seen the future and you are not in it? 6 civilizations, the oldest and greatest the galaxy had ever known. They did not die. They laid down their tools, turned away from the stars, and faded into silence, killed not by a weapon or an enemy, but by the knowledge that their time was already over, that the future belonged to something they had locked in a cage. I sat in my dim office for a very long time after I finished reading. The archive was silent around me. My tea had gone cold hours ago. The screen glowed with the interdict file's final page, and I stared at it and understood everything. The barrier was not built to protect the galaxy from humans. It was built to protect the galaxy from the truth about humans. Because the truth was a weapon more devastating than any fleet. The founders had not been destroyed by the species they sealed away. They had been destroyed by the certainty that the species would surpass them. The knowledge had drained their will to exist, as completely and as irreversibly as if someone had pulled the plug on their entire civilization. And I was sitting in my office with that same truth loaded on my screen, preparing to release it on every civilization in the Concord. I looked at the observation feeds from inside the barrier. The humans were building something new, a space telescope of extraordinary precision, designed to map the cosmic microwave background radiation, the faint echo of their universe's birth, with resolution that surpassed anything they had achieved before. If it worked as their scientists predicted, it would be sensitive enough to detect subtle distortions in the space-time around their solar system, distortions that would match the barrier's signature. They were about to notice the walls of their cage. I checked the barrier's decay rate. Sulin had sent me updated data that morning, and the numbers made my scales flatten against my neck. The rate had increased. Not gradually, it had jumped. The microfractures were widening faster than any model predicted, and the cause was not structural fatigue. It was pressure from the inside. Every instrument humanity built to study the universe was also an instrument that interacted with the barrier. Their curiosity was not a metaphor for destructive force. It was, literally and physically, the most destructive force the barrier had ever encountered. They were not trying to break free. They were just trying to understand, and their understanding was tearing the cage apart. I made my decision. I sent the interdict file to every archive, every university, every news network, every government body, and every military command in the Galactic Concord simultaneously. I sent it without redaction, without summary, without softening commentary. The raw truth. The complete record, the projections and the asymptote, and the founder's despair, and the barrier's decay rate, and all of it, transmitted to every corner of the galaxy at the speed of light. The reaction was instantaneous, and it was exactly what the founders had predicted 12,000 years ago. The Concord did not fracture, it shattered. Within 72 hours, the unified political structure that had governed galactic civilization for millennia was in pieces. Emergency sessions were convened and collapsed. Diplomatic channels overloaded and went silent. Military fleets that had not been mobilized in centuries powered up their weapons and waited for orders that nobody could agree on. Three factions emerged from the chaos almost overnight. The hardliners, drawn primarily from the older species, demanded immediate reinforcement of the barrier. Pour every resource the Concord possessed into strengthening the cage, extend its lifespan by another 10,000 years, and use that time to develop a permanent solution. It was the founders' plan, recycled. The plan that had led the founders to extinction. The militants, a coalition of military commanders and defensive strategists, demanded a preemptive strike. Bring down the barrier deliberately, on their own terms, and send the largest fleet in galactic history into the Sol system to eliminate the threat before it could emerge. Better to face the species now, while it was still confined to a single planet with pre-stellar technology, than to wait until it achieved capabilities that the projections said would surpass anything the galaxy could field against it. And then there was the third faction, smaller than the others, quieter, made up primarily of younger species, civilizations that had risen after the founders' disappearance and had never known the elder races. They did not demand military action or barrier reinforcement. They asked a question. Why are we afraid of a species that does not even know we exist? The question cut through the panic like a blade through smoke. It was so simple, so obvious, that no one drowning in the chaos of the founders' revelations had thought to ask it. The founders had sealed Earth because of what humans might become. The hardliners wanted to reinforce the seal for the same reason. The militants wanted to strike for the same reason. Every faction was reacting to a projection, a model, a mathematical prediction of a future that had not happened yet. No one had considered the possibility that the models, while perhaps accurate about human potential, might be wrong about what humans would do with that potential. While the Concord tore itself apart over this question, the barrier answered it. The collapse happened without warning, in the deep hours of the galactic standard night cycle, at a moment when half the Concord's leadership was asleep and the other half was arguing. The monitoring stations, those ancient machines that had been keeping their tireless vigil for 12 millennia, reached the end of their operational lifespan simultaneously, all of them, every single station, at exactly the same moment, as if they had been programmed to fail together. Which, I realized later, they had been. The founders had not built the barrier to last forever. They had built it to last exactly as long as their projections said it needed to. Not a day longer. Whether this was wisdom or resignation, I still cannot say. The spatial distortion envelope destabilized in a cascade that took less than 4 minutes. The fractures that had been slowly widening for centuries tore open, connected, merged, and dissolved. 12,000 years of containment, the greatest engineering project in galactic history, unraveled in the time it takes to brew a cup of tea. The distortion field collapsed in on itself, the warped space-time snapping back to its natural configuration with a burst of gravitational energy that registered on sensors across the galaxy. Sol system was suddenly, silently, nakedly visible. Every telescope in the Concord that happened to be pointed in the right direction detected the new star system within hours. A yellow main-sequence star with 8 planets, unremarkable by any astronomical standard, except for the fact that it had not been there the day before. And it was loud. The system was broadcasting more electromagnetic energy per unit volume than any comparable region of space. Radio signals, television transmissions, radar emissions. The accumulated noise of a technological civilization that had been shouting into the void for over a century, trapped behind a wall that had just disappeared. The humans noticed too. They noticed immediately. I was watching the observation feeds from my office on Altheris when it happened. My door locked, my hands clasped together in my lap to keep them from shaking. The humans' deep space monitoring systems detected the change in the space-time geometry around their solar system within minutes. Their astronomical observatories were flooded with data that did not match any existing model of local space. Stars had shifted position by tiny amounts. Background radiation patterns had changed. The geometry of the universe around them had subtly but measurably altered. Their scientific community erupted. Papers were published within hours. Theories were proposed and debated on their global communications network at a pace that made my head spin. They did not know what had happened, but they knew something had changed, and they mobilized to understand it, with a speed and coordination that would have taken most species in the Concord weeks to achieve. Within days, ships launched. Not warships, not military vessels bristling with weapons and crewed by soldiers under orders to secure a perimeter. These were science ships, small, crewed by galactic standards, burning chemical fuel, carrying instruments and experiments and supplies, crewed by volunteers who had competed for the privilege of flying toward an unexplained anomaly in the fabric of space-time, because they wanted, more than anything, to know what was on the other side. They flew toward the unknown, because it was unknown, and that was reason enough. I watched those small ships accelerate out of their home system, and I felt something I had not expected, not the cold terror that the founders had felt when they looked at the projection models, not the paralytic dread that was consuming the Concord's leadership. What I felt was awe, pure, uncomplicated, overwhelming awe at a species that looked at the vast and dangerous and incomprehensible universe and responded not with fear, but with curiosity so powerful that it overrode every rational argument for staying home and staying safe. The Concorde's armada arrived at the Sol system 12 hours after the barrier fell. Fleet Admiral Corvan Sheldathos commanded the largest military force ever assembled under a single command flag, pulled together from 26 species, in a mobilization that had been in contingency planning for decades. 3,700 warships, ranging from cruisers to planet breakers, carrying weapon systems that could crack continental plates and sterilize biospheres, arranged in a formation that covered more space than some small solar systems. They emerged from faster-than-light transit at the edge of the Sol system and found 3 human vessels holding position near the boundary of their star's gravitational influence. 3 vessels, against 3,700 warships. The size disparity was so extreme that several of Corvan's tactical officers initially classified the human ships as debris or sensor artifacts. They were small, angular, built from metal alloys that the Concorde had stopped using centuries ago. They were powered by engines that produced visible exhaust trails, a propulsion method so primitive that it belonged in a museum. They had no detectable shields, no weapon systems that the Armada's sensors could identify, and hull armor that would not have withstood a single shot from the weakest weapon on the weakest ship in Corvan's fleet. By every military metric that existed, they were irrelevant. 3 children's toys floating in the path of an armada that could have swatted them aside without breaking formation. The human ships did not retreat. They did not power up hidden weapons, or call for reinforcements, or send panicked distress signals back to their homeworld. They held their position, steady and calm, and began broadcasting. The signal went out on every electromagnetic frequency, simultaneously. It was not in any language. It was not a greeting, or a warning, or a surrender, or a challenge. It was mathematics. Prime number sequences, followed by geometric constants, followed by fundamental physical ratios. Pi and the golden ratio, and the speed of light and the gravitational constant, laid out in a structured sequence that built from simple to complex, each element confirming that the sender understood not just the numbers, but the relationships between them. It was a mathematical handshake, a proof of intelligence, a way of saying, without words and without any shared language, we understand the universe. We understand that you understand the universe. We would like to talk. Corvan Sheldathos read the transmission on his command display. He read the interdict file on the adjacent screen, scrolling through the founder's projections, the development curves, the asymptote, the quiet extinction of 6 civilizations that had looked at the same species and seen only a threat. He looked at his weapons. He looked at the 3 small ships hanging in the void, broadcasting mathematics into the darkness, waiting for someone to answer. He looked at the faces of his bridge crew, and he saw the same fear that had consumed the founders 12,000 years ago. The fear of being surpassed. The fear of obsolescence. The fear that everything they had built, and everything they were, would be rendered meaningless by a species that had not even reached the stars yet. And then Fleet Admiral Korvan Sheldathos made the decision that saved the galaxy. Not with a weapon, not with a strategy, with a choice. Power down all weapon systems across the fleet. Open a communication channel on the frequencies they are using. Match their mathematical framework and respond in kind. His officers stared at him. Several protested openly. One junior commander demanded a formal tribunal to challenge the order on grounds of dereliction of duty. Korvan looked at the junior commander and spoke in a voice that carried the weight of 12,000 years of history. The founders had the largest fleet ever assembled, he said. They chose containment instead of contact, and it killed them, not the humans. The choice killed them. I will not make the same mistake. The Armada's weapons went dark. 3,700 warships, the most powerful military force in galactic history, stood down. The communication channel opened, and for the first time in 12 millennia, the species that had been sealed inside the barrier heard a voice from outside. The first exchange was mathematical. Numbers, constants, proofs, equations, both sides establishing a common framework, a shared language built from the only thing that every intelligent species in the universe has in common, the mathematics of reality itself. It was slow, careful, each side confirming that the other understood before moving to the next level of complexity. It took 2 hours. By the end of those 2 hours, the human ship's communication team had improvised a crude translation matrix that could handle basic conceptual communication, not fluent conversation, not poetry or philosophy, but enough to say simple things and be understood. Then the human commander appeared on screen. She was small. Even by human standards, she was not physically imposing. Dark hair pulled back from her face, wearing a uniform that prioritized function over ceremony. Her name was Claire Whitfield. She was 38 years old, an astrophysicist who had volunteered for the mission because she had spent her entire career studying the universe and had never imagined she would get the chance to meet someone from outside it. She looked at the view screen. She saw the vast alien armada arranged before her 3 tiny ships, thousands of warships from dozens of species, weapon systems that could erase her homeworld from existence, a military force so far beyond anything humanity had ever encountered that there was no frame of reference for it. And she smiled. Not a diplomatic smile calculated to project confidence, not a nervous smile meant to mask fear. The genuine, uncontrollable smile of someone who has just had the single greatest question of their life answered. Are we alone? No. No. You are not alone. Here is the proof, arrayed before you in warships and alien faces, and technology beyond your comprehension. She spoke, and the translation matrix rendered her words with a slight delay. We have been looking for you for a very long time. I watched from Altheris. I watched the moment that the founders had feared for 12,000 years, the moment when the sealed species made contact with the galaxy, and I waited for the catastrophe, for the aggression, for the dominance display, for the unstoppable force that the projection models had predicted. What came instead was a conversation. Tentative, clumsy, full of mistranslations and confused pauses, and moments where both sides had to stop and recalibrate their understanding of what the other was trying to say. But genuine, honest. 2 groups of intelligent beings meeting for the first time and trying, with genuine effort and goodwill, to understand each other. Claire Whitfield asked questions. She asked about the Armada, about the species represented, about the Concord, about the galaxy. She asked with the same hunger that had driven her ancestors to build telescopes and split atoms and launch ships into the void. She wanted to understand, not to gain advantage, not to identify weaknesses, to understand. And when Corvan Sheldathos, following a protocol that he was inventing in real time, because no protocol for this situation had ever existed, explained that humanity had been sealed inside a barrier for 12,000 years by ancient civilizations that feared what humans would become, Claire Whitfield went quiet. Her crew went quiet. The three small ships hung in the vastness of space, surrounded by an armada that could have obliterated them between one heartbeat and the next, and processed the fact that they had been imprisoned without their knowledge for longer than their recorded history. When Claire spoke again, her voice was steady. She did not rage. She did not threaten. She did not demand justice or retribution or explanations. She asked a question that made Fleet Admiral Corvan Sheldathos sit down slowly in his command chair and stare at his display in silence for a long time. "Were you afraid of us?" Corvan told the truth. Yes. Claire nodded, as if this made sense to her. As if she had already considered the possibility that the universe might contain beings who found humanity frightening and had made peace with it before she ever left her home planet. Then she said something that I have thought about every single day since I first heard it. We were afraid of being alone. I closed the interdict file. I archived it properly, in the public records, where any citizen of the Concord could access it. No more secrets, no more sealed vaults, no more sub-level omegas. The truth was out, and the galaxy would have to learn to live with it. The founders feared the asymptote. They saw a future in which humans surpassed all measurement and all comprehension, and the certainty of it killed them. Slowly and quietly and completely, the way knowing the end of a story can drain the will to keep reading. But watching First Contact unfold on my screen, watching Claire Whitfield extend her hand across 12,000 years of fear and isolation, I realized that the founders had made one critical error in their projections, one variable they had failed to account for, one factor that their models, for all their sophistication, had never included. They had modeled what humans would become. They had mapped every axis of capability, every development curve, every technological trajectory. Their mathematics was flawless. Their projections were almost certainly accurate. Humans would surpass the galaxy. Maybe they would surpass comprehension itself. Maybe the asymptote was real, and someday humanity would become something that mathematics could not describe. But the founders had never modeled what humans would choose to be. They had seen the power and assumed the worst, because in 12,000 years of guiding galactic civilization, every species they had ever encountered used power the same way, as a weapon, as leverage, as dominance. The founders themselves had used their power to build cages and suppress potential and delete star systems from the sky. Power, in the founders' experience, always meant control. Humans could have done the same. The projections said they would eventually have the capability to do anything, literally anything, reshape the galaxy, rewrite the laws of physics, become something beyond definition. But their first act upon meeting the galaxy that had imprisoned them was not a demand, not a threat, not a display of the terrifying potential that had driven 6 civilizations to extinction. It was a handshake, an open palm, a smile, a voice saying, "We have been looking for you." I began writing a new file. Not a warning, not an interdict, not a containment protocol or a threat assessment or a military contingency. I opened a fresh document in the public archive and wrote a welcome. A formal record of first contact between the Galactic Concord and the species designated human, registered in the open records for every civilization in the galaxy to access. In the summary field, where archivists traditionally note the historical significance of the document being filed, I wrote a single line. The founders sealed Earth away because they saw a future they could not control. They were right. They could not. But control was never the point. The humans taught us that in the first 5 minutes of knowing us, some futures are not meant to be controlled. They are meant to be met. I saved the file and closed my terminal. Outside my office window, the stars were shining the way they always shone, patient and ancient, and indifferent to the small dramas of the species that lived among them. But somewhere out there, in a system that had been hidden for 12,000 years, a species with no ceiling, no limits, and no fear, was taking its first steps into a galaxy that had been waiting for them longer than it knew. For the first time in 40 years as an archivist, I did not feel like I was cataloging the past. I felt like I was watching the beginning,